There's a specific, quiet shift that tends to happen somewhere around the 1-year mark of genuine no contact, sometimes later, sometimes a bit earlier, but almost always eventually, and almost nobody warns you about it in advance. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with any clear signal announcing its arrival. One day you simply notice that something about the entire situation feels different than it did in the earlier months. Different in a way that's honestly a little disorienting, because it doesn't match the story you'd been telling yourself about what extended silence was supposed to accomplish. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to frame it honestly, because when you go no contact for too long, this happens. Could mean several different things, and most of them aren't what people expect going in. We're going to walk through what genuinely tends to unfold, both inside you, and as far as it's possible to understand, on the other side of the silence as well. Once no contact stretches well beyond the initial weeks and months, most people brace themselves to survive. Some of what we'll cover is genuinely reassuring. Some of it is worth understanding precisely because it complicates the simple, satisfying story many people hope extended silence will eventually deliver. Let's start with what happens on your side first, because this is where the most significant and most under-discussed shift actually occurs. In the early months of no contact, silence tends to feel active, effortful, something requiring ongoing vigilance and deliberate restraint. This is the phase most people prepare for, the phase most advice about no contact actually addresses, resisting the urge to check social media, resisting the urge to reply if contact resurfaces, managing the raw, immediate grief of genuine separation. But somewhere further along, considerably further than most people expect, something shifts in the actual texture of the silence itself. And understanding this shift matters enormously for making sense of what you might be experiencing right now, if you've maintained genuine distance for an extended period. Here's what this shift actually involves. The silence stops requiring effort. It stops being something you're actively maintaining and starts simply being the shape of your life, the same way a room you've lived in for years stops registering as new or notable, even though it once felt entirely unfamiliar when you first moved in. This is worth understanding as one of the clearest markers of genuine, deep healing. But it's also worth naming honestly why this shift can feel strange rather than purely relieving when it first arrives. For a long time, the effort of maintaining no contact functioned as a kind of ongoing relationship with the situation itself, something requiring your attention, your discipline, your daily engagement, even if that engagement was entirely private and entirely internal. When this effort finally genuinely dissolves, something that had structured a significant portion of your emotional life simply isn't there to structure it anymore. And this absence, paradoxically, can produce its own kind of disorientation, even though it represents genuine progress rather than any kind of regression. Let's talk about a second thing that tends to happen the longer genuine no contact continues. It's one that connects directly to something we've traced throughout this entire series, but takes on a different quality specifically with extended time: the gradual fading of specific, vivid memory into something considerably more abstract and considerably less emotionally charged. This is worth understanding precisely, because it explains something that confuses a lot of people who assumed going in that they would always remember everything with the same intensity and the same clarity that characterized the earliest, most painful stretch of separation. What actually happens reliably, as the longer genuine distance continues, is that specific memories, specific conversations, specific incidents that once felt seared into permanent, precise detail begin to soften, blur slightly at the edges, sometimes even become genuinely difficult to recall with the same precision you once could have offered without hesitation. This is worth understanding as entirely normal rather than concerning, a natural consequence of how memory actually works over extended time, particularly memory connected to material that's no longer being actively reinforced through ongoing contact or ongoing ruminations. But it's also worth naming something important about how this fading can feel, because it often produces a specific kind of anxiety worth addressing directly. The fear that forgetting details means somehow betraying the reality of what happened, or worse, that this fading memory leaves you more vulnerable to being drawn back in should contact ever resurface. It's because the sharp, protective clarity you once relied on has genuinely, measurably softened. This fear deserves a direct, honest response because it's genuinely common and genuinely worth addressing rather than dismissing. Fading detail is not the same as fading accuracy about the pattern itself. You can genuinely forget the exact wording of a specific argument from 3 years ago while still, entirely accurately, understanding and remembering the overall shape of what that relationship actually was, its patterns, its costs, its fundamental incompatibility with your well-being. What tends to remain, even as specific incidents blur, is something considerably more valuable and considerably more protective than sharps, detailed memory and accurate, settled understanding of the pattern itself. One that doesn't actually require perfect recall of every individual moment in order to remain reliable and trustworthy going forward. What we haven't yet explored is what tends to happen on the other side of extended silence, what this means for the likelihood and nature of contact resurfacing. After considerably longer stretches than the earlier months this entire series has more commonly addressed, and why understanding both sides of this extended timeline together, rather than focusing only on your own internal experience, actually completes the picture in a way that matters considerably for how you should think about genuine, long-term healing going forward. Let's talk about what tends to happen on the other side of extended silence, because this is worth examining honestly, even though it requires acknowledging genuine uncertainty about something you can't directly observe or confirm. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about the mechanisms that typically drive a narcissist's return, disruptions in current supply, significant life transitions, evidence of your own visible thriving. These mechanisms don't simply stop operating after enough time passes. If anything, extended silence tends to increase the eventual likelihood that one or more of these triggers will eventually align, simply because more time means more opportunity for a current relationship to falter, more opportunity for a personal crisis to arise, more opportunity for news of your continued success to eventually reach them through some indirect channel. This is worth understanding precisely, because it corrects a common assumption people sometimes develop the longer silence continues without contact resurfacing, the assumption that enough time passing means the door has somehow permanently, automatically closed on their end, that their own capacity or inclination to reach out has simply expired along with the silence itself. This assumption, while understandable, doesn't actually match what we've traced throughout this entire series about the underlying mechanisms driving these returns. Time alone doesn't resolve the underlying instability that produces reactivation. It simply means the specific triggering circumstances haven't yet aligned, which is different from those circumstances becoming permanently impossible. Here's what's worth understanding about this reality, though, because it's genuinely important for how you should hold this information rather than letting it become a source of ongoing anxiety. The fact that contact could theoretically resurface, even after considerable time, doesn't actually change what matters most about your own healing, and understanding why requires returning to something we established in an earlier exploration throughout this series: genuine indifference, once fully developed, doesn't require contact to remain permanently absent in order to hold. It requires that contact, whenever and if it ever arrives, simply doesn't carry the same disruptive power it once did. This distinction matters enormously, because it shifts the actual goal away from something you can never fully guarantee, permanent silence from someone whose behavior you cannot control, and towards something you genuinely can build and maintain, your own settled stability, regardless of what eventually happens on their side. Let's talk about a specific pattern worth understanding regarding contact that resurfaces after genuinely extended silence, considerably longer than the months this series has more commonly addressed. Because this particular timeline tends to produce something worth naming directly: contact that often arrives with a noticeably different tone than earlier attempts might have carried. This is worth understanding through something we discussed in an earlier exploration regarding the phases a narcissist tends to move through after a relationship ends: minimization, narrative construction, testing behavior, and eventually, for something resembling genuine reflection, though this remains genuinely rare. Extended silence, considerably longer than what most people initially maintain, sometimes coincides with contact that emerges from further along in this sequence, occasionally carrying more apparent self-awareness, more apparent acknowledgement than earlier, more strategic attempts at reconnection typically displayed. This is worth naming carefully, because it would be dishonest to suggest this difference in tone automatically indicates genuine change has occurred. Remember everything we traced throughout this entire series about the actual test that matters: sustained behavioral change observed over meaningful time, rather than the content or tone of any single message, however different it might sound from earlier attempts. What extended time does provide, though, is simply more opportunity for whatever genuine internal shifts might have occurred on their side, if any occurred at all, to have actually taken root before contact resurfaces, which means contact after truly extended silence deserves the same patient pattern-based evaluation we discussed in earlier explorations throughout this series. Neither automatically dismissed as certainly manipulative, nor automatically trusted simply because more time has passed and the tone feels different. Now let's talk about something worth naming directly, because it addresses a specific risk that extended no contact can sometimes unexpectedly create. The risk that your own accumulated stability, built carefully over considerable time, can occasionally make you more vulnerable to contact resurfacing precisely because that stability has made the entire situation feel genuinely resolved, genuinely behind you, in a way that can lower your guard more than the vigilant, effortful early months ever allowed. This is worth understanding as a real, if somewhat counterintuitive, risk worth preparing for, precisely because the three-step sequence we discussed in an earlier exploration throughout this series, useful and necessary during the early, more volatile months, can start to feel unnecessary once genuine stability has settled in, leaving you without an active plan should contact eventually, unexpectedly resurface after years of complete silence. This is worth understanding as the reason maintaining some version of readiness, even during periods of genuine, settled peace, remains worthwhile. It's not because you should live in ongoing anticipation of contact resurfacing, which would undermine the genuine peace you've worked so hard to build, but because a brief, occasional check-in with yourself, a simple, low-effort reminder of what actually happened and why distance remains genuinely appropriate, costs very little and provides meaningful protection against exactly the kind of disorientation that can occur when contact arrives into a life that had genuinely, comfortably stopped expecting it. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to bring together everything we've traced about extended silence, both what happens inside you and what tends to happen, or might eventually happen on the other side of it, into a coherent understanding of what genuine, long-term healing actually requires, and why the goal was never simply surviving no contact for as long as possible, but building something considerably more durable than distance alone could ever provide. Let's bring everything together now, because this final understanding is what actually matters most from everything we've traced throughout this exploration. Genuine, long-term healing was never actually about the duration of silence itself, however important that silence has been throughout the earlier stages of this entire process. It was always about what that silence made possible, the internal work it protected and gave space for, work that, once genuinely complete, no longer depends on the silence continuing indefinitely in order to remain real. Here's the distinction worth understanding with complete clarity, because it resolves the tension this entire exploration has been sitting with. There are two very different things that can be true when someone maintains no contact for an extended period. The first is genuine, settled healing, where distance was the necessary container for real internal work, and where that work, now complete, means contact resurfacing, whenever and if it ever does, no longer holds the power it once did. The second is extended avoidance, where distance has been maintained, but the underlying grief, self-doubt, or unresolved hope for eventual understanding was never actually addressed, simply held at bay through the structural absence of contact rather than through any genuine internal resolution. From the outside, both of these look identical. Both involve years of silence, no messages sent, no contact initiated. But they represent entirely different internal realities, and only one of them actually produces the stability this exploration has been describing throughout. This is worth understanding as the actual, practical takeaway from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. If you've maintained extended no contact and find yourself genuinely uncertain which of these two categories actually describes your own experience, this uncertainty itself is worth examining honestly, rather than assumed away simply because considerable time has passed. Ask yourself directly, using the same specific inventory we discussed in an earlier exploration throughout this series regarding the 7 distinct areas of healing, has grief actually moved through its natural process? Or has it simply gone quiet because there's been nothing recent to reactivate it? Has self-trust actually been rebuilt? Or has its absence simply gone unnoticed because no one has directly challenged your perception in years? Has the hope for eventual understanding actually been released? Or has it simply been suspended, still quietly present, waiting for exactly the kind of contact this exploration has been discussing throughout, ready to resurface with surprising intensity the moment that contact eventually arrives? This honest inventory matters enormously because it protects you from a specific, painful surprise that extended silence can sometimes produce, discovering only when contact actually resurfaces after years of apparent peace, that the underlying work was never actually complete, that the silence had been doing the job of avoidance rather than the job of genuine resolution, and that years of apparent stability collapse considerably more easily than anyone, including you, would have predicted, precisely because that stability was never actually built on the foundation this entire series has spent so much time describing. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, one that ties together not just this specific video, but so much of what this series has been building toward from its very beginning. No contact was never actually the destination. It was always the container, the protected space within which the actual work of healing could occur, undisturbed by the exact kind of interference that ongoing contact would have made genuine healing considerably more difficult to achieve. When that work is genuinely done, the container itself stops mattering as much as it once did, not because contact suddenly becomes safe or desirable, but because your own stability no longer depends on the container's continued, uninterrupted integrity in order to remain real. So if you've maintained no contact for what feels like a genuinely long time, and you're wondering what this extended silence actually means, whether for you or for whatever might eventually happen on the other side of it, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series. The silence itself was never actually the healing. It was the space where healing became possible, and the real measure of your progress was never simply how long that silence lasted, but what you actually built inside it, whether grief moved through its natural, difficult course, whether self-trust genuinely returned, whether hope for their understanding was genuinely released rather than simply suspended. If that work is genuinely done, contact resurfacing, whenever it happens, if it ever happens at all, becomes simply information, arriving into a life that no longer requires their continued absence in order to remain whole. Let's add one more layer worth understanding here, because it addresses something rarely discussed when people talk about extended no contact, specifically what happens to your own identity during this period, separate from the grief, self-trust, and hope we've already traced throughout this exploration. The longer genuine silence continues, the more likely it becomes that you build an entire chapter of your life, sometimes several chapters, entirely outside the context of that relationship. New routines, new people, new versions of yourself that developed without any reference point connected to who you were while you were still entangled with them. This matters considerably more than it might initially seem, because it means that contact resurfacing after truly extended silence isn't just reaching toward the person you were when the relationship ended. It's reaching toward someone who, in many genuine ways, no longer exists in quite the same form. This is worth understanding as a specific kind of protection that time alone provides, independent of whether the internal work we discussed has been fully completed. Even incomplete healing benefits from this simple, structural reality. The self who eventually receives a message after years of silence has accumulated experiences, relationships, and growth entirely unconnected to the narcissist's influence, and this accumulated life functions as its own kind of buffer, even in moments where old patterns momentarily reactivate. You are never, after genuinely extended time, responding from exactly the same place you would have responded from immediately after the relationship ended. And this matters even when the specific internal work remains imperfect or incomplete. Let's talk about something else worth naming honestly, because it connects to a common but rarely discussed experience among people who maintain no contact for years: a strange, occasionally guilty curiosity about what has actually happened to the narcissist during this extended silence, entirely separate from any wish to reconnect. This curiosity isn't necessarily evidence of lingering attachment in the way it might initially feel. It's often simply ordinary human interest. The same kind of mild curiosity most people carry about anyone who once occupied significant space in their life, regardless of how that relationship ended. Distinguishing this ordinary curiosity from genuine, concerning pull back toward reconnection matters, and the distinction usually lies in what the curiosity actually requires from you. Passing curiosity doesn't require action. It doesn't produce genuine urgency. It simply exists occasionally without demanding to be resolved through actual contact or investigation. Finally, it's worth naming directly that extended no contact sometimes produces its own quiet griefs, separate from the original grief of the relationship ending, a grief connected to time itself, to years spent healing rather than simply living, to the recognition that considerable energy went toward recovering from something that never should have required this much recovery in the first place. This secondary grief deserves acknowledgement too, without judgment, without the pressure to feel only gratitude for having survived. You're allowed to hold both truths simultaneously: genuine pride in the stability you've built, and genuine sadness about how much time and effort building that stability actually required, time that was never owed to anyone but yourself, spent instead repairing damage you never should have had to repair at all.